Frank Matthews. In 1973, a man named Frank Matthews was supposed to show up to a Brooklyn federal courthouse to face charges that could have put him away for 50 years. He had been out on $325,000 bail, which at the time was one of the highest bail amounts in American history. He never showed, and from that day forward, nobody has ever seen him, heard from him, or confirmed whether he is alive or dead. The FBI spent over 5 decades looking for him. They checked every continent, chased every rumor, and followed every lead. Then, in December of 2025, they quietly closed the case for good. Frank Larry Matthews was born on February 13, 1944, in Durham, North Carolina. He moved to Philadelphia as a teenager, ran numbers, then relocated to Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn by 1965. He was ambitious in a way that made the Italian families uncomfortable. When he first arrived in New York, Matthews tried to do business with the Gambinos and the Bonanos. They turned him down, so he went around them entirely. Through a Harlem numbers operator named Spanish Raymond Marquez, Matthews connected with a Cuban supplier named Rolando Gonzalez Nunez and bought his first kilo of cocaine for $20,000. From there, he built an operation that eventually stretched across 21 states, from Boston to Alabama to Missouri, using only black and Hispanic underbosses. He supplied Philadelphia kingpin Major Coxon and the Black Mafia, ran 2 fortified Brooklyn drug mills, one called the Ponderosa and the other called the OK Corral, and between 1969 and early 1970, he moved between 100 and 150 kilos of heroin into New York City alone. And then he did something that had never been done before. In 1971, Matthews organized a summit in Atlanta, bringing together the biggest black and Hispanic drug dealers in the country to discuss how to bypass the Italian mob altogether. The DEA was watching. They had surveillance on the entire meeting. A second summit followed in 1972 at the Sands Hotel during the Ali Quarry rematch in Las Vegas. Matthews was no longer just a dealer. He was building an infrastructure. His lifestyle matched the money. He bought a mansion on Tot Hill in Staten Island, 3 blocks from Gambino boss Paul Castellano. Casinos in Vegas laundered his cash for a 15 to 18% fee. An IRS agent once told him, while walking out of a Vegas courtroom, that he owed back taxes on $100 million he had earned in 1971 alone. The violence that surrounded him was staggering. On Easter Sunday, 1972, a shootout at Club Harlem in Atlantic City killed Matthews's Philadelphia point man, Tyrone Mr. Millionaire Palmer, along with 4 bystanders, and wounded 26 more. 799 witnesses were interviewed. Not a single one cooperated. Then the indictment came. December 1972, a Brooklyn federal grand jury charged him over 40 pounds of cocaine seized in Miami. He was arrested in January 1973 at McCarran International Airport in Las Vegas. Bail was initially set at $5 million, which at that point was the highest bail amount ever set in the United States. It was later reduced to $325,000. The charges carried up to 50 years on 6 counts of tax evasion and conspiracy to distribute heroin and cocaine. An assistant United States attorney named Raymond J. Deary, who would later become a federal judge himself, told Matthews in a courthouse hallway that a life sentence was very possible. Matthews apparently heard him loud and clear. On July 2, 1973, he vanished. His Staten Island safe was empty when agents raided it. The DEA estimated he fled with somewhere between $15 and $20 million in cash. but none of it was ever recovered. His common-law wife, Barbara Hinton, never cooperated with investigators. According to reporting, when federal agents approached her over the years, she told them she had never heard of a man named Frank Matthews. One of his former associates, a man named Liddy Jones, later said that Frank knew what the 848 statute could do to him, and that there was no way he was going to spend the rest of his life in prison. Federal prosecutor William Callahan called him a pioneering giant of drug distribution. He would have been 81 in 2025. The FBI never found him, and somehow, that is still the least strange part of what comes next. Nicky Barnes. On June 5, 1977, a man named Leroy Nicholas Barnes stared out from the cover of the New York Times Magazine, wearing a tailored suit and a red, white, and blue tie, under a headline that simply read, "Mr. Untouchable." It was the kind of move that made him the most famous drug dealer in New York City. It was also the kind of move that made the President of the United States pick up the phone and demand his prosecution. Barnes was born on October 15, 1933, in Harlem. He grew up fast and fell into the drug trade early. While serving time at Green Haven Correctional Facility on a drug conviction, he met members of the Colombo and Lucchese crime families. When that conviction was overturned on a technicality with the help of a mob-connected lawyer, Barnes walked out and built something that Harlem had never seen before. He called it the Council. 7 men, including Barnes, Joseph Jazz Hayden, Wallace Rice, Thomas Gaps Foreman, Ishmael Muhammad, Frank James, and a protege named Guy Fisher, structured like a mafia commission but operating independently. The council moved roughly $1 million worth of heroin per month out of a single Harlem garage. By 1977, an estimated 2 million addicts were buying Barnes's product, and his personal net worth was somewhere in the range of $50 million, with jewelry alone valued at $7 million. Barnes wore custom suits, drove luxury cars, and moved through Harlem like he was untouchable. That nickname would not age well. That magazine cover changed everything. President Jimmy Carter saw it and ordered the Justice Department to intensify the prosecution. An undercover DEA agent named Louis Diaz had already been building the case, and cooperator Jazz Hayden was feeding information from inside. The cover did not create the case, but it made sure nobody in Washington was going to let it die. Barnes was indicted in March of 1977. The trial in the Southern District of New York used an anonymous jury, which at the time was almost unheard of in federal court. The jurors were kept behind screens. Their identities were sealed. It was a measure of how much fear the council generated in Harlem. Lead prosecutor Robert B. Fisk, Jr., who was then the United States Attorney, called the council the largest, the most profitable, and the most venal drug ring in New York. Presiding Judge Henry F. Worker convicted Barnes in November 1977 and sentenced him on January 19, 1978, to life without parole. And that should have been the end of the story. But Barnes found out something while locked up that changed everything. His protege Guy Fisher had taken up with Barnes's mistress, and the council had stopped paying his legal fees. The betrayal cracked him open. In 1982, Barnes flipped. He sent federal prosecutors a list implicating 109 people. He testified against 44 traffickers, 16 of whom were convicted, and admitted involvement in 8 murders. Rudy Giuliani, then the United States Attorney for the Southern District, personally sought reduction of his sentence. Barnes was resentenced to 35 years, released in August of 1998, and entered witness protection. At sentencing years earlier, Judge Worker had said that the saddest part of all was that the great majority of people Barnes was hurting were people in his own neighborhood. Sterling Johnson, Jr., a former special narcotics prosecutor who later became a federal judge, summed up Barnes more simply. "He was the number one," Johnson said. "He had charisma." Barnes died on June 18, 2012, of cancer, somewhere in witness protection. His obituary was not published until 7 years later, when journalist Sam Roberts broke the news in the New York Times in June of 2019. Even in death, Barnes was hard to find. His daughter later recalled him saying that he was a product of his environment, and that if he had had parents the way children have parents now, things would have been different for him. In his final years, Barnes had told the Times that he lived within his paycheck, that he wanted to get up every day and go to work and be a respected member of his community. Whether he managed that, only the people in his witness protection identity would know. One of the men Barnes named on that list was the same man who had taken his woman and his throne. And that man's story is worth telling on its own. Guy Fisher. In early 1978, a man named Guy Fisher and two partners bought the Apollo Theater in Harlem. They spent $250,000 renovating the place, replacing the sound system, rebuilding the backstage area, adding reserved seating, and reopened it on May 6th of that year. For a brief window, one of the most legendary stages in American music was partially owned by one of the biggest heroin dealers in New York City. Fisher was not yet 31 years old. Guy Thomas Fisher was born on July 21, 1947, in the Patterson houses of the South Bronx. The projects were rough, and Fisher adapted to them. Barnes recruited him in the early 1970s, and Fisher became his most trusted protege. He had a street nickname, Radio, and he used it to build a reputation. Thanksgiving turkey giveaways in the neighborhood, youth basketball tournaments. He co-invested with Barnes in housing complexes across Harlem. Fisher was a multimillionaire before he turned 30, and he wanted everyone to know it. He was the council's public face in a way that Barnes, despite the magazine cover, never fully embraced. On September 30th, 1974, a routine traffic stop turned up roughly $103,000 in his trunk. He tried to bribe the officers on the scene. That got him about 9 months on bribery and impersonation charges, but it also kept him out of circulation during the bulk of the FBI's surveillance of the council. That is the reason his 1977 trial ended in a hung jury. He was the only council member who walked. With Barnes locked up after 1978, Fisher stepped into the vacuum and took over the operation. He ran Harlem. He co-owned a piece of the most iconic theater in Black America alongside Rich Morris and Elmer T. Morris. He was moving heroin at volume. And no, that is not an exaggeration. The Apollo shut down again by 1979, well before Percy Sutton's group bought it in 1981. But for a brief window, a heroin kingpin was helping run the stage where Ella Fitzgerald and James Brown had made history. Then Barnes turned. The same betrayal that sent Barnes to the feds, Fisher taking his mistress and cutting off his legal fees, now brought the full weight of the federal government down on Fisher's head. He was indicted in 1983 and convicted in 1984 in the Southern District of New York on charges of operating a continuing criminal enterprise, racketeering, narcotics conspiracy, and multiple murders. The sentence was life without parole. Fisher spent the next 36 years in federal prison. During that time, he earned an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and in 2008, a doctorate in sociology. He mentored younger inmates. He stayed away from drugs and violence behind bars for decades. The world outside changed beyond recognition while he was locked up. The crack epidemic came and went. The Twin Towers fell. A black man was elected president. And Fisher was still inside. In 2020, at 73 years old, he filed a motion for compassionate release. On October 9, 2020, Judge John F. Keenan of the Southern District wrote an opinion granting the motion. The judge noted that by his own efforts and the passage of decades, Fisher was no longer the 35-year-old drug kingpin who had been sentenced nearly 40 years earlier. He acknowledged that Fisher had improved himself through education, had helped others, and intended to use whatever time he had left to guide young people away from crime. The men with whom he had committed heinous crimes, the judge wrote, were dead, or like Fisher, undone by time and fate. The motion was granted. Fisher walked out a free man at 73 years old. He had entered prison during the Reagan administration. He left during a global pandemic. He had been locked up longer than most of the people reading about his release had been alive. The man who once co-owned the Apollo Theater, who drove through Harlem like he owned every block, was released into a world that barely remembered him. You'd think someone would have said something. Nobody did. Fisher ran Harlem from the top. But across the East River in South Jamaica, Queens, a different kind of empire was being built. One where the money came faster and the violence came cheaper. Kenneth Supreme McGriff. At its peak in 1987, the Supreme team was pulling in $200,000 a day in street-level crack sales out of the Baisley Park houses in South Jamaica, Queens. The crew had over 100 members, rooftop sentinels with two-way radios, and a leader who had named himself after a principle of the 5% Nation. His name was Kenneth McGriff. The streets called him Supreme. And by the time the federal government was finished with him, a jury would hear closing arguments describing him as one of the most dangerous, feared, and ruthless gangsters in all of Queens. McGriff was born on September 19, 1960, in South Jamaica. He founded the Supreme Team in 1981 with his nephew Gerald Prince Miller as second in command. The division of labor was clean. McGriff handled the business. Miller handled the enforcement. A rapper from the same neighborhood would later put it plainly on a track called Ghetto Quran, saying that Premi was the businessman and Prince was the killer. That rapper was Curtis Jackson. The recording nearly cost him his life. McGriff caught his first serious charge in 1985, a state narcotics conviction that initially carried 9 years to life. It was overturned on appeal. He was back on the streets within 22 months. In 1987, federal agents caught up to him again on a continuing criminal enterprise charge. He pled guilty and took 12 years. Around the same time, the 1988 murder of rookie NYPD officer Edward Byrne by a rival Queens crew led by Pappy Mason brought an avalanche of law enforcement pressure down on every drug operation in Southeast Queens, including the Supreme Team. The heat was relentless. McGriff was paroled in February of 1993. Most men would have stayed quiet after 2 convictions and a federal stretch. McGriff rebuilt. After his release, he put together what prosecutors later called the McGriff Enterprise, trafficking heroin and cocaine into Maryland and North Carolina. The operation moved 30 kilograms of heroin and 150 kilograms of cocaine. He also developed close ties with Irv Gotti's Murder Inc. record label, and prosecutors would later allege the relationship went far beyond friendship. In January of 2003, federal agents raided the label's offices in a case that sent shockwaves through the hip-hop industry. Prosecutors alleged McGriff used the label to launder more than $1 million. The Gotti brothers were ultimately acquitted in December of 2005, But McGriff's involvement had opened a door that the feds had no intention of closing. The indictment that ended everything came out of the Eastern District of New York. Prosecutors charged McGriff with murder conspiracy, drug trafficking, and ordering the 2001 contract killings of Eric E. Moneybags Smith and Troy Big Nose Singleton for $50,000 each. The trial landed before Judge Frederick Block. Lead prosecutor Carolyn Picorni told the jury in closing that when Supreme gets in a fight with somebody, he does not go to the cops, he does not hire a lawyer, he hires a hit team to assassinate them so that their mothers can barely recognize them when they go down to the morgue. On February 1st, 2007, the jury convicted McGriff on all counts. The government had sought the death penalty. Judge Block had publicly called the death penalty pursuit absurd, telling Washington there was no chance in the world the jury would return a death verdict. The jury declined to impose death. McGriff was sentenced to life without parole. As of 2025, he remains at United States Penitentiary Beaumont in Texas. He was also long suspected in the October 2002 murder of Run DMC's Jam Master Jay and the May 2000 shooting of Curtis Jackson, better known as 50 Cent, who was hit 9 times outside his grandmother's house in South Jamaica. That shooting came after Jackson recorded the track that named McGriff and Miller by their street names. McGriff was never charged for either crime. When federal prosecutors finally brought charges in the Jam Master Jay case, they indicted Ronald Washington and Carl Jordan Jr., who were convicted in February of 2024. Every kingpin on this list built an empire, but only one of them convinced the world he smuggled heroin inside the coffins of dead American soldiers. Whether that story is true is a different matter entirely. Frank Lucas. There is a scene in the 2007 film American Gangster where Denzel Washington, playing a Harlem drug lord named Frank Lucas, opens a coffin that has just arrived from Southeast Asia and pulls out bags of heroin hidden alongside the body of a dead American serviceman. That image became one of the most iconic moments in crime cinema. The problem is that the man the movie was based on almost certainly made the whole thing up. Frank Lucas was born on September 9, 1930, in LaGrange, North Carolina. He moved to Harlem and claimed to have been the right-hand man of legendary Numbers boss Bumpy Johnson. That claim was disputed by Bumpy's widow Mamie, by Nicky Barnes, and by historians who noted that Bumpy deliberately distanced himself from the heroin trade. After Bumpy's death in 1968, Lucas built his own operation on 116th Street, branding his product Blue Magic and claiming it was 98% pure, though by the time it reached the street, it had been cut down to roughly 10%. His supply chain ran through his cousin Leslie Ike Atkinson, a United States Army Master Sergeant stationed in Bangkok. Lucas used a tight crew of North Carolina relatives he called the Country Boys, and reportedly required them to handle product unclothed, so nothing could be skimmed. His lifestyle was reckless. He wore a $125,000 chinchilla coat to the 1971 Ali Frazier fight at Madison Square Garden, a move that put him directly on the FBI's radar. On January 28, 1975, a joint DEA and NYPD task force raided his home in Teaneck, New Jersey, and seized $584,683 in cash. Lucas later insisted that between $9 and $11 million was stolen during the raid. He was convicted in 1976 in both federal and state court. Judge Irving Ben Cooper sentenced him to a combined 70 years, 40 federal and 30 state. Lucas cooperated almost immediately. He claimed his information led to the conviction of 3/4 of the DEA agents in New York. Federal Judge Colleen McMahon later found that claim, which appeared as an intertitle in the American gangster film, to be wholly inaccurate. McMahon publicly admonished Universal Studios, saying it would behoove a major corporation owned by a major news organization not to put inaccurate statements at the end of popular films. His sentence was reduced to time served plus lifetime parole in 1981. He was rearrested in 1984 on a fresh heroin and cocaine charge, served 7 more years, and was released in 1991. In 2012, at age 82, he pleaded guilty to attempting to cash a $17,000 federal disability check twice and received 5 years of probation. And then there is the coffin story. Lucas told journalist Mark Jacobson in a 2000 New York Magazine profile that he smuggled heroin inside the coffins of dead American soldiers returning from Vietnam. The DEA never found heroin in a single coffin. Leslie Ike Atkinson called the story the biggest hoax ever perpetrated and said he never had anything to do with transporting heroin in coffins or cadavers. DEA agent Charles Lutz, who worked the case, confirmed no heroin was ever recovered from a service member's coffin. Judge Sterling Johnson, Jr., who had prosecuted narcotics cases in that era, admitted that he too had believed the coffin story for years, but the public record showed otherwise. The actual seizures in the DEA's case involved heroin hidden in teakwood furniture shipments. Even Lucas walked parts of it back toward the end. He once admitted in a late interview that he had built one false bottom coffin once. Sterling Johnson was blunter about the movie. He called it 1% reality and 99% Hollywood. He said Frank was illiterate, Frank was vicious, Frank was violent, and that Frank was everything Denzel Washington was not. Lucas died on May 30, 2019, in Cedar Grove, New Jersey, at the age of 88. He once said that he wanted to be rich, that he wanted to be Donald Trump rich, and that so help him God, he made it. Later, he said something else. He said heroin is the worst business and that you cannot get any lower. If you're liking this video and you're not subscribed yet, now's the time. We drop new cases every day. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Rich Porter. On January 3, 1990, a man named Richard Porter was found dead near Orchard Beach in the Bronx with gunshot wounds to the head and chest. He had $2,239 in his pocket. A month earlier, he had been one of the wealthiest crack dealers in Harlem, a man who owned more than a dozen luxury vehicles and was rumored to never wear the same outfit twice. The streets called him Money Rich. The man who killed him was supposed to be his friend. Richard Thomas Porter was born in Harlem in 1964. He was the eldest of 3 children raised by his mother, Velma Porter. He started selling drugs at 12 years old, and by his early 20s had built a crack operation out of 132nd Street and the surrounding blocks that made him one of the most visible dealers in uptown Manhattan. He worked alongside Azy Faison and Alberto Alpo Martinez in a loose partnership that for a while seemed untouchable. Porter was flashy, generous, and known across Harlem as a man who took care of the block. Hard numbers on his income are scarce, but the lifestyle spoke for itself. More than a dozen luxury vehicles, custom outfits he reportedly never wore twice. The nickname Money Rich was not ironic. His cocaine connect toward the end was a man named Richard Fritz Simmons. Then, in December of 1989, everything collapsed at once. On December 5th, Porter's 12-year-old half-brother Donald was kidnapped on his way to PS 92 on West 134th Street. The kidnappers cut off the boy's finger and delivered it to an uptown McDonald's bathroom, along with a ransom note demanding $500,000, later reduced to $350,000. The kidnapping was orchestrated by Porter's own maternal uncle, a preacher crew member named Johnny Apple Porter. That is not a typo, by the way. His own uncle arranged the abduction of a 12-year-old boy for ransom money. While Rich was still desperate to find his brother, Alpo Martinez killed him. Porter had gone to Martinez carrying a Louis Vuitton bag of consigned cocaine, given to him by Simmons after Simmons refused a cash loan. Martinez shot him in the head and chest and took the drugs. It was a robbery disguised as a meeting between friends. Police found $2,239 in Porter's pocket. For a man whose lifestyle had defined Harlem excess, it was a grim final number. Donald's body was found on January 28, 1990, roughly a mile from where Rich's body had been discovered weeks earlier. The two deaths were linked by blood and betrayal, but carried out by different hands. The crew took Donald. Alpo took Rich. Until Martinez's own 2019 video confession, many in Harlem still believed the preacher crew was responsible for both killings. That was only half true. Martinez was eventually convicted, cooperated with the government, and served roughly 35 years before being released into witness protection. On Halloween night of 2021, Martinez was shot and killed in Harlem. He had been back in the neighborhood less than a year. He was 45 years old. The man who betrayed Rich Porter ended up dying on the same streets where the betrayal happened. Kevin Childs, a former associate and founder of Don Diva magazine, later said that Porter's death had a huge impact on Harlem and that the timing could not have been worse. He noted that they dressed like rappers before hip-hop brought that style to the world. The 2002 film Paid in Full, with Mekhi Phifer as Porter, Cameron as Martinez, and Wood Harris as Faison, turned the story into one of the most referenced crime narratives in hip-hop history. Jay-Z and Kanye West referenced Porter by name on the track Niggas in Paris. For years, many in Harlem believed the preacher crew was responsible for both deaths. That was only half the truth. The crew took Donald. Alpo took Rich. Porter left behind a neighborhood that never fully recovered from that winter. And across the East River, in the same housing projects that had produced Kenneth Supreme McGriff, the man who had enforced the Supreme Team's rule was about to get his own reckoning. Gerald Prince Miller. In 1993, a federal judge in Brooklyn named Raymond J. Deary looked across his courtroom at a man named Gerald Miller and sentenced him to 6 concurrent life terms, plus 20 years. Before handing down the sentence, Deary told Miller and his co-defendants that they had stuck together and proven their loyalty, and he would give them that. But, the judge said, there was a real high price to pay for that loyalty, and they were going down in flames. Gerald Miller was born around 1964 in Queens. He was Kenneth McGriff's nephew and had served as second-in-command of the Supreme Team since its founding. When McGriff went to state prison in 1985, Miller took over. He was not the businessman his uncle was. He was the enforcer. He wore a bulletproof vest and baseball cap constantly and drove a bulletproof BMW that was rumored to have James Bond-style modifications. Curtis Jackson, who grew up in those same blocks, said it plainly on record. People feared Prince and respected Premi. The Supreme Team under Miller's command continued pulling in 6 figures a day. His bodyguard was Jose Hunt. His security chief was Ernesto Piniella. Top lieutenants like Wilfredo Babywise Arroyo and David and Raymond Robinson handled retail and cocaine processing. When Miller was briefly imprisoned and then released in 1989, he rebuilt the retail operation to roughly $10,000 per day in street sales. It was less than the peak. It was still an enormous amount of money moving through a single housing project. Miller's violence was systematic. In 1987 alone, At least 8 murders were ordered by Prince and McGriff. The Supreme Team had corrupted a New York State parole officer named Ina McGriff, no relation to Kenneth, along with a parole secretary named Ronnie Younger. They fed Miller intelligence, addresses, and information on cooperators. When they handed over the addresses of the Bolden brothers, both were shot. Isaac Bolden did not survive. On McGriff's behalf, Miller arranged the murder of cooperator James Page after the corrupt parole official identified him. In the summer of 1987, Miller beat a charge for a point-blank shooting that happened in broad daylight, with witnesses present. The witnesses recanted 3 words that tell you everything about how the Supreme Team operated in Baisley Park. Miller was indicted in March of 1990 on RICO, continuing criminal enterprise, money laundering, and narcotics conspiracy charges. He was convicted at trial in the Eastern District of New York in 1992. Judge Raymond J. Deary sentenced him to 6 concurrent life sentences plus 20 years. And somehow, it gets worse. Miller spent over 3 decades behind bars, most of it at high-security federal facilities. His case file made him one of the most feared inmates in the federal system. There was no reason to believe he would ever see daylight again. Then the First Step Act changed the math. In September of 2024, Judge Nicholas G. Garaufis granted a resentencing motion. In his written opinion, Garaufis acknowledged what Miller called his evolution over the years, and wrote that it was enough to overcome the severity of the egregious, unlawful, shameful, and embarrassing behavior that had hurt his community and family. Miller was released from United States Penitentiary Big Sandy in Kentucky on approximately September 11, 2024. He walked out of a federal prison that had been built after he went in. The Supreme Team was a memory. The Baisley Park houses still stood, but the empire that had run them was gone. The man Judge Deary once said was going down in flames had somehow outlasted the fire. Miller is sometimes confused with members of the Preacher Crew, which operated out of the Bronx and Harlem. They are different organizations. The Supreme Team was a Queens operation, through and through, and the man who ran its streets for 6 years is now free. The drug trade in New York always produced 2 kinds of legends: the ones who got rich and got caught, and the ones who got rich and walked away. The next man on this list did something almost nobody else managed. He chose basketball over the empire, went to prison anyway, and came out the other side a completely different person. Pee Wee Kirkland. In 1968, the Chicago Bulls drafted a guard out of Norfolk State named Richard Kirkland in the 20th round. The following year, they drafted him again in the 13th round. Both times, Kirkland turned them down. The NBA was offering roughly $20,000 a year. Kirkland was already making that in a single deal running heroin out of Harlem. Kirkland was born on May 6, 1945, in Harlem, near 155th Street and the Rucker Park courts that would make him a legend. He was an all-city guard at Charles Evans Hughes High School, a scorer who could light up any gym in the 5 boroughs. He played at Kittrell College, where he reportedly averaged over 40 points per game, and then at Norfolk State, where he earned the 1968 CIAA Most Valuable Player Award, alongside future NBA Hall of Famer Bob Dandridge. According to Basketball Reference, his draft history is real. 1968, 20th round, first pick, 212th overall by the Chicago Bulls. 1969, 13th round, 4th pick, 172nd overall, again by the Bulls. Both times, he said no. Kirkland had the talent. He had the offers. He had everything a young man from Harlem needed to get out. He did not take it. He once said that his family was poor and that he used to tell his mother he was selling newspapers. But the money came fast. The heroin money came faster than any basketball contract ever could. They called him the Bank of Harlem. He reportedly bought drugs at $300,000 and sold them at $900,000 in single transactions. He turned down 2 NBA contracts because the street money was simply bigger. The NBA was offering roughly $20,000 a year. Kirkland was pulling that in a single weekend. In 1971, federal agents arrested Kirkland on heroin conspiracy charges. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. He served roughly 4 years before parole. But while he was inside, the IRS built a tax evasion case against him. The FBI investigation that ran during his incarceration led to a second indictment that added more time. In total, Kirkland served approximately 11 years between 1971 and 1988. He reportedly scored 135 points in a single game in the Anthracite Basketball League, the prison league, though that number, like much of his legend, has grown beyond what can be independently verified. When he came out, Kirkland changed course entirely. He later said that he spent 11 years in prison and came out realizing he owed a tremendous debt to society. He founded Nike's School of Skills program, became a youth mentor, and dedicated himself to keeping kids in Harlem off the path he had taken. He played the role of a Georgetown recruiter named Phil Red in the 1994 film Above the Rim. Bob Dandridge, his Norfolk State teammate who went on to a Hall of Fame NBA career, said he remembered Kirkland as a good basketball player, but also as a good person who was giving back to his community, particularly in Harlem. On February 24, 2026, Kirkland was inducted into the New York City Basketball Hall of Fame. He was 80 years old. The man who turned down the NBA twice was finally getting recognized for what he did on the court, instead of what he did off it. Kirkland has claimed his Harlem operation was much bigger than Frank Lucas's, that he turned down UCLA to play with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and that he dropped 50 on NBA pros at the Rucker. Some of those stories hold up, some do not. His 1968 and 1969 Bulls draft selections were real, but they were very late-round picks, not realistic starting spots. The $30 million revenue figure that appears in secondary sources has no independent verification. The basketball legend has outgrown the documentary record, but the man behind it earned his place on this list twice over, once for the empire and once for what he did after it fell. Every name on this list operated inside New York's borders. But there was one dealer whose empire ran out of Washington, D.C., and whose supply chain depended entirely on a connection that ran straight through New York City. Rayful Edmond III. In April of 1989, a 24-year-old man from Northeast Washington, D.C., was arrested on federal drug charges. Prosecutors told the press he controlled somewhere between 20 and 50% of all the cocaine coming into the nation's capital. His trial featured the first anonymous jury in D.C. history. The jurors sat behind bulletproof glass. Even the judge did not know their names. The man's name was Rayful Edmond III, and at his trial, prosecutors called him the Babe Ruth of crack. Edmond was born on November 26, 1964, on M Street Northeast in Washington, D.C. The drug trade was a family business. His mother, Constance Bootsy Perry, and his father, Rayful Edmond II, were both involved. His best friend, Royal Brooks, ran alongside him. His chief enforcer, Jerry Millington, was the common-law husband of Edmond's sister, Rochelle. By his early 20s, Edmond's organization was pulling in an estimated $2 million per week, with annual revenues in the range of $300 million. and ties to roughly 30 homicides. His cocaine supply ran through Colombian connections, particularly Osvaldo Trujillo Blanco, who was Griselda Blanco's son, and a Cali-linked figure named Freddy Aguilera. Those connections used New York City as a port of entry and warehouse hub, making Edmund's D.C. empire functionally dependent on New York's drug infrastructure. He wore a $45,000 diamond Rolex, a 3-carat diamond stud, and a $15,000 diamond cross. He was also obsessed with Georgetown basketball. In 1988, Coach John Thompson confronted Edmund in a closed-door meeting after learning about his friendships with players John Turner and Alonzo Mourning. Thompson later said his thing was basketball and that he wanted to confront the problem immediately. Turner eventually left Georgetown. Mourning testified as a defense character witness at Edmund's trial, not for Edmund, but for his enforcer Millington. The arrest came on April 18, 1989, after a May 1988 cocaine deal in Los Angeles produced informants who named Edmund. Journalist Sari Horwitz broke the story in the Washington Post. Edmund was 24 years old. He was indicted under RICO with 14 co-conspirators. His trial before Judge Charles R. Ritchie was unlike anything D.C. had ever seen. The anonymous jury, the bulletproof glass, the sealed identities. Edmund was convicted in December of 1989 on 9 counts, including continuing criminal enterprise. On September 17, 1990, he was sentenced to mandatory life without parole. He was 25 years old. His mother Bootsy was convicted in March of 1990. 10 family members were convicted overall. And then Edmund did something that should have been impossible. From inside United States Penitentiary Lewisburg, between 1991 and 1994, he formed a relationship with Trujillo Blanco and Freddy Aguilera and began running cocaine back into D.C. through 3-way prison phone calls. He was not dabbling. He was operating at industrial scale from a federal cell. Former Attorney General Eric Holder later described it on 60 Minutes, saying that at his maximum, Edmund was doing about 400 kilograms of cocaine per month while in prison, compared to about 300 at his maximum while on the street. He was moving more product in a cell than he had on M Street. And no, I am not making that up. When confronted in 1994, Edmund flipped. His cooperation was extensive. It led to over 100 convictions and dismantled networks that stretched from D.C. to Colombia. In February of 2021, Judge Emmett G. Sullivan granted a sentence reduction under Rule 35B. On July 31, 2024, the Bureau of Prisons transferred Edmund to community confinement at a Miami halfway house overseen by the Nashville Residential Reentry Management Office. He died there on December 17, 2024, at age 60. The Florida coroner ruled the cause complications of hypertensive cardiovascular disease. Marion Barry, the former D.C. mayor, once wrote in his memoir that Edmund was a young, likable guy with a good personality, and that a lot of his friends he played basketball with had no idea he was involved in drug selling. Barry said Edmund was basically pulled into it by his family. Edmund is dead. His empire is gone. But the city he flooded with cocaine in the late 80s is still living with the consequences. Bumpy Johnson. Before Frank Lucas, before Nicky Barnes, before the Council and the Supreme Team and Blue Magic and the Babe Ruth of crack, there was a man in Harlem who ran the streets with a reputation that made all of them possible. His name was Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. Nobody called him Ellsworth. Everybody called him Bumpy. Johnson was born on October 31, 1905, in Charleston, South Carolina. He was sent to Harlem at 13 after his older brother was accused of killing a white man. He spent his teens and 20s in and out of prison, fighting, stealing, and building a reputation for violence that would follow him the rest of his life. But Bumpy Johnson was not just a brute. He was literate, well-read, and he published poetry during the Harlem Renaissance. The inmates and neighbors who knew him called him the Professor. In the early 1930s, Johnson became the chief enforcer for Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the numbers queen of Harlem. St. Clair was at war with Dutch Schultz, who was trying to take over the Harlem numbers racket by force. That war became one of the most iconic power struggles in New York City's criminal history. After Schultz was assassinated in 1935 on orders from Lucky Luciano, Johnson negotiated a 4-decade arrangement. The Italian families, first under Luciano, then Vito Genovese, then Frank Costello and the Genovese family, let Bumpy run Harlem's operations in exchange for tribute. It was a deal that kept the peace for the rest of his life. In 1952, Johnson was indicted on a federal conspiracy charge for selling heroin. He was sentenced to 15 years and served the majority of his time at Alcatraz as inmate number 1117 from 1954 to 1963. He was locked inside one of the most brutal federal prisons in the country, while Harlem continued to operate under the arrangement he had negotiated. When he was released in 1963, the community celebrated his return. Some accounts describe a parade through the neighborhood, though mob museum researchers have called that detail an exaggeration. What is not in dispute is that Bumpy returned to Harlem and resumed his position as though he had never left. Johnson was arrested more than 40 times in his life. In December of 1965, he staged what became an iconic act of defiance by walking into a Harlem police station, sitting down, and refusing to leave. He was charged with refusal to leave a police station. He was acquitted. The episode cemented his reputation as a man who feared nothing and no one, not the Italians, not the police, and not the federal government that had already taken a decade of his life. His wife Mamie, whom he married in 1948, described him in her 2008 memoir as a complicated, well-read man who paid college tuition for the children of impoverished neighbors. Jeff Schumacher, a research director at the Mob Museum, noted that in all his research, nobody called him Ellsworth. Frank Lucas claimed to be Johnson's protege and successor. Bumpy's widow disputed that claim. So did Nicky Barnes. And so did historians who noted that Johnson deliberately kept his distance from the heroin trade, his own 15-year sentence notwithstanding. Bumpy was a numbers man first and a heroin defendant second. On July 7, 1968, Bumpy Johnson walked into Wells' restaurant in Harlem. He had just been served coffee, a chicken leg, and hominy grits. His childhood friend, Junie Bird, was sitting beside him. Johnson collapsed. It was congestive heart failure. Bird cradled him as he died. He was 62 years old and still under federal indictment for drug conspiracy. He was buried at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Forrest Whitaker played him in the television series Godfather of Harlem. Lawrence Fishburne played him in Hoodlum. Prodigy of Mobb Deep released an album named after him. Every drug kingpin who came after Bumpy Johnson operated in a world he had helped build. Whether they honored his legacy or distorted it depends on who you ask. 10 men. 4 decades. From penny bet numbers games to multi-million-dollar heroin pipelines to crack empires that burned through entire neighborhoods. Some are dead, some are in prison. A few walked free. All of them left a mark on New York City that the city is still carrying. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.